And I'd like to look at a Catholic that Joseph Pierce could have spoken just as readily, if not better, on this topic than I can. But I want to talk a little bit about J.R.R. Tolkien and why I think he matters, especially with the theme of this conference and looking at the kind of chaos of the modern world. So obviously Kirk is one response, and I think Kirk's response, I didn't mention this in the last talk, but one of the things that converted him to Catholicism was, and I can't remember the man's name, but it was a priest who had argued that the best thing you can do as a Christian is to light a candle in the corner where you find yourself. And that Kirk loved that. And he honestly believed, and I think he lived it out, that no matter how much we dream of big solutions in Congress or elsewhere, or even at a place like Hillsdale where we're all on the same page and we've got this common mission, that in the end it really does come down to us being good where we find ourselves. And Kirk always thought that this was one of the great mysteries of life, that an action that we take that's a right action, when we do the right thing in helping our neighbor, when we do the right thing when we're writing a book or we're talking to someone, we promote truth or we promote goodness or we promote beauty, that you have absolutely no control over what that good thing will do. You only know it's your duty to do it. And somehow that good thing will manifest itself. Now, I think we could maybe make that a little kind of cheesy and almost like karma, but Kirk thought that this was actually the nature of grace, that grace was not something that we had the power to implement overall, but something that we were given, we received it, and we did the right thing with it at the moment. So Kirk, and this a lot of, as I mentioned, is the founder of conservatism, Kirk was often turned to by a lot of people who thought, well, look, if we're going to have a good Republican Party, we need to read Kirk, and you just come away really frustrated because there's nothing in Kirk that would tell you how to be a good Republican. His whole idea of being a good conservative is just to be a good person. And he doesn't have solutions for education. He doesn't have solutions for subsidies or how many tanks we need. It's about doing the right thing at the moment and pursuing that. So I think for a lot of current politicians, it's not helpful. And it's not helpful for political parties either, because the real solution comes at a very local level. So for me, that's a good transition into Tolkien, because Tolkien, as one of the greatest Catholics of the last century, I mean, certainly would be in the top 5, I think, of important Catholics and those who had such an influence. Tolkien also, even though now we take him for granted because he's so much in the culture with the Peter Jackson movies and other things, when he was writing, he was an obscure, relatively obscure Oxford Don. And he was a devout Catholic from his childhood, and there's only one moment he may have wavered, and when Tolkien says he wavered from the faith, that means he may not have gone to daily mass that week. I mean, it's nothing. It's not like when he says I wavered as if he had gone off on a bank heist or something. He was very, very, very particular about his faith in the best way and very exacting about it. So any deviation at all, and that literally meant skipping mass maybe for a daily mass, that was bad for him. People have tried to read more into his letters where he says there was a moment where I was unfaithful, but that's all it was, certainly. But Tolkien is a great example of being in a community and that community enlivening more communities. That is, to change things. I mean, you think about what you've done this weekend, and I don't know how many of you have been here both days. I don't know what the numbers were yesterday, but just think about the people you've met. Think about Dusty. Just coming up here, even in the few minutes, and I don't know if Dusty gave a talk, but even in the few minutes that you've met him, that he's organized all of this, individual action. It's not huge. We've got just a certain number of people in here, but it's meaningful. And not one of us in this room, even those of you I met briefly and talked to you just for a moment, I learned your names, learned you were from Hutch or from Wichita, those are things that matter. They even if it's brief, it matters. It's not superficial. It's something that it's in the moment, it matters at that moment, and we don't know what that will mean. We don't know where it will go. Kirk was always of a mind, as was Tolkien. When you do that right thing, who knows what's going to happen after that? Imagine a kind word you give to somebody that maybe is habit for you. Somehow someone sees that, they're a witness to that, and 20 years from now, they're in a similar situation, and their response, the brain kicks in, and they say the same thing you said to someone now. You have no control over that. But that's grace. That's the mystery of grace. that it works in that very amazing way, in ways we can never predict. And in fact, if we try to predict, we're playing God. And we can't do that. That's where real evil comes in, right? Our job is not to make others like us, but to make them more themselves, what they're meant to be. That's a very Tolkienian sentiment, that we want someone not to be little Tolkiens, but to be themselves. Nathaniel needs to be Nathaniel. He can't be little Brad, can't be mini Brad. That's my job as a father, is not to make him my clone. That would be evil. That would be hubris. That's what Satan does, right? Think about what Jesus does. Jesus, when the gospel writers write, John is not less of a person because he writes the gospel and it's God's word. He's more John than he ever was. That's the mystery of grace. And that is what I think is so important, not just in Kirk's works, but in Tolkien as well. There's a humility in it. There's this recognition that I'm Brad. There's certain things I can do. There are a billion things I will never be able to do. And when I encounter someone who does something, my reaction is not to be jealous, and of course it is, and that's sin. But it's to recognize, it's to overcome that jealousy and promote that. To recognize that that great thing and the excellence of that thing is what needs to be promoted. Not that I can't do it, but that you can do it, and in that excellence, we make everybody better. It's also why equality at certain levels can be very dangerous, because of course we diminish people rather than making them greater. And so we have to be careful about that. How do we leaven? How do we make people better? Or how do we make them what they were meant to be? How do we help in some way? So Tolkien is this fascinating figure, and of course older than Kirk. Kirk's born in 1918, Tolkien is born in 1892. But there are some similarities there. One of the greatest similarities between J.R.R. Tolkien and Russell Kirk, well, they have similar politics. They also have ultimately similar religious views. But one of the things that to me is fascinating is how much they use imagination. And that's really what I want to focus on in this talk. What does imagination mean? And how is it that imagination, properly understood, is an act of grace? And of course, imagination has to be individual. We come to our individual imagination, and yet we have to be careful. If our imagination is so individual, it could be too idiosyncratic that the person next to us would never understand it. Then we've lost it. Our imagination has to be rooted in something, but it also has to be able truly to be free, to allow grace to work. And I think this is one of Tolkien's greatest contributions. It's Kirk too. Kirk wrote the horror fiction, which for him was just a way of kind of expressing truths in a way that people mass could understand and could take that in large doses. Tolkien's was a little bit different. It was a little bit more scholarly, a little bit more academic. In many ways, Kirk could throw off a novel very quickly. He was an extremely fast writer. He wrote about, he could type actually about 120 to 130 words a minute without error. Tolkien wasn't like that. If you've ever seen Tolkien is very particular about his script. We have hardly any typewritten manuscripts left from Tolkien. He wrote everything out. And there was an act of almost piety and holiness to his writing, his art. In fact, just to get ready for this lecture, I thought, well, this was Friday. As I mentioned to you, we left yesterday morning, Saturday. Friday, I pulled out, I don't know how many of you have ever had a chance to look at this. When we think of Tolkien, we think of The Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit or The Silmarillion. But Tolkien was also an amazing artist, actual painting, watercolors especially. And when you look at his paintings, he's so vivid in the way that he imagines things, his color choices. I mean, they're far beyond my skill, certainly. But just the color choices are so warm and so inviting. But what makes them so Tolkienian in their own way is what he does around the borders. So he'll have a beautiful picture of Hobbiton. I mean, truly beautiful. It's a fantasy place. Obviously, Hobbiton doesn't exist. It's an idealized kind of English shire of the Middle Ages. But there it is. And if you look at his painting, it's not just the painting that's great. He has these wild designs around the whole border that you would never notice right away. It's one of those things you notice after maybe the second or third look at the painting. And then you look at the detail of these. So he may do a watercolor, but then he uses actual ink, pen and ink, scroll and ink to do these elaborate designs. And I've often wondered, I thought, man, you just did this perfect painting, and now you did these elaborate designs where you have a dot and a triangle and a swirl, and you've repeated that 100 times. You know how easy it would be to mess that part up? The border, after you've done this beautiful painting, but he doesn't do it. Tolkien is so exact about that, and there's so much reality to his fantasy that it breathes life and it breathes grace in so many ways. So let me give you just a quick biographical sketch of Tolkien, and I'll talk about why I think he's so important for us, especially as Catholics and thinking about the Catholic imagination. Imagination, of course, can come in many ways. It can be diabolic. Imagination is a very powerful thing. So Tolkien quickly, and then imagination. So Tolkien is born in January of 1892, and born into, much like Kirk, born into an old Protestant family that had really lost its Protestantism. Kirk's family, they were spiritualists, as I mentioned. Tolkien's family weren't spiritualists, but they had the same they had once been firmly Protestant. They had really lost that Protestantism. It was just something that was in their background. And they were really much more intellectual, and Tolkien's mother especially, very, very intellectual, extremely liberally educated, very well-read person, but middle class. Kirk's, they were lower class, but the Tolkiens were middle class. Tolkien's father had gone into banking, and because there weren't a lot of opportunities in England, he had taken a job in South Africa, and especially with the diamond industry. So the father packs up the family. It's mom, dad, and they'll ultimately have two sons, Tolkien, John Ronald Reuel. Sometimes he went by John, sometimes by Ronald, sometimes J.R.R. His friends always called him Tollers. He's English with other nicknames. So there's John, the oldest, and then he has a little brother, and this was a fairly common English name of the 19th century for a boy. His brother's name was Hilary. So the four live in South Africa. But the mom and the boys don't like it. And so they decide to go back to England, but the father doesn't have a job in England, so he stays in South Africa. When the Tolkiens arrive, the mom and the two boys, and they get back to England, there's a telegram waiting for them at the port that their father had died in between. He had caught a disease, had not survived it, and he was gone. So between the time they left him, he was healthy. By the time they arrived in England, he had passed away. And so Tolkien's mom, Mabel, had no way of supporting the family at all. But the family, and some of you may know this was famous in England at least, it never really caught on in America, but the family had made some money by making pianos. Tolkien piano was well known throughout all of England, but that wasn't directly to Mabel, the mom, and her sons. They would have to kind of turn to that side of the family for help, which they did, and that side decided to help them a little bit. But Mabel is restless, and so she's trying to raise these two boys, no husband now because of course he's passed away, and she starts intellectually being very alive. She starts walking past a Catholic church, a Roman Catholic church, and she starts going in to Mass, always having been told her whole life, these people are evil, they have a foreign dictator as their head, a very typical kind of English bigotry against the Catholic Church. And so she goes in and she starts learning more and more, and she's very taken with it. She loves the liturgy, which of course she could have gotten in the Anglican Church, but she also loves the intellect that goes with it. And not surprisingly, she comes across the greatest work of the greatest Roman Catholic of England in the 19th century, John Henry Newman. And she's very taken with Newman's writings, just stunned at how good, how clear this guy is, not only in the way that he argues, but especially in his style. And so she becomes very involved in Birmingham, England, with the oratory that's there, that's dedicated to the teachings, he's now passed away, but dedicated to the teachings of Newman. She converts to Catholicism, mostly taken by Newman, and really taken with that theology and the whole idea that Newman brings to theology. The moment she converts, her family basically disowns her. They stop paying for anything at all. No education for the boys, no support for her. They tell her she has to leave the Catholic Church or she's out of the family, and she refuses to leave. Now, they don't actually believe in anything. They're not Protestant. They were, but they've lost that. But they're deeply anti-Catholic. So even though they're not pro-Protestant, they are anti-Catholic. Well, Mabel gets a form of tuberculosis, and it could have been taken care of. They go to the family, they ask for money, family refuses. If she leaves the Catholic Church, they'll pay for her. If not, no. She dies, she passes away. So Tolkien and his brother have now lost their father, and they've lost the mother. And in Tolkien's mind, and I always have to give him credit for this, you could imagine what he might think of Protestants after this. You could imagine a deep bigotry that would have arisen. He chose not to think of it that way, but he did always think of his mother as a martyr, always as a Catholic martyr. And he believed very strongly to the last, his dying breath, that he always had to live up to her example. And when she passed away, because she did not want the boys being raised by the Protestants, she actually turned the boys over to a man named Father Francis Morgan, who was one of Newman's students. So they were raised in their high school years, junior equivalent of junior high and high school. They were raised by Father Francis Morgan and the oratory that was dedicated to Newman's teachings there. So just imagine what kind of influence that would have on Tolkien. And he never, unlike one of his friends, they both went to St. Aloysius and were about the same age, Christopher Dawson, great English Catholic, also a convert, never could get a job in any of the English schools. He got one at Harvard finally, but he could not in the English schools because he was so open about his Catholicism. Tolkien was always open in a private sense. That is, he didn't miss Mass. He was a daily Mass Catholic. He carried his rosary everywhere. But it wasn't always in his scholarship in the way it was for Dawson. But I have to tell you a very quick story about this as well. One of my favorite stories, interesting person I had to meet. He passed away, unfortunately, about 5 years ago. Sir Martin Gilbert. Anybody know? I don't have many brushes with fame, but I do know Sir Martin Gilbert. Anyone familiar with him at all? Warren is, a few people. Sir Martin Gilbert was in the Thatcher administration. But he's a PhD in history, and he was, until his death, he was the leading and official biographer of Winston Churchill. So he had produced over 80 books, most of them bestsellers during his life. Incredible guy. But despite the fact he's a sir, not something you would normally think, he was also Jewish, and he was a citizen of Israel. So he started teaching at Merton College at the same time Tolkien was retiring. And just think about this bigotry. 1963, they're at Merton College together. Tolkien is at the very end of his career. Sir Martin is at the beginning of his. This is 1963. That is not that long ago. Because he was Jewish and Tolkien was Catholic, they were not allowed to sit at high table with the other professors. They had to sit at a separate table. Can you imagine that? And Sir Martin, I had a chance to meet him. He's incredible. He taught at Hillsdale in his last 10 years. And he took me to lunch. I didn't even know he knew who I was, but he read my Tolkien book, and he told me I was all wrong, and he took me to, it was great, actually. I'll tell you why I was wrong. But he took me to lunch, and he told me all these stories about Tolkien, things I'd never heard of. I never knew that story. I knew Tolkien will allude that, oh yeah, the Protestants wouldn't let me do this or that. I actually thought he was exaggerating. And Sir Martin tells us, no, the Jews, we all loved each other. The Jews and the Catholics, we were great allies because everybody hated us. It's like, Tolkien was great. He said they had a blast hanging out together, and they wouldn't have had there not been that discrimination. Can you imagine? But anyway, Tolkien served in World War I, and I'll talk about why that's important as well. But in his own memoirs, Tolkien talks about how he was a terrible soldier. It was horrible, he said. He was a bad officer, he was a bad soldier. So in my own book, I wrote, yeah, Tolkien was a soldier and he served, but he was a terrible soldier. I took him at face value. Now, this is really important, and if I could go back and rewrite that book, I would, for this very reason. Sir Martin, at lunch, scolded me. He said, Bradley, how could you have taken that seriously? He said, you obviously don't understand the mentality. Everybody who survived World War I was a bad soldier. He said Tolkien, until he died, had nothing but horrific survivor's guilt. He said they all did. He said, do you think they ever talked about it at high table? Never. Would they talk about it in class? Never. And when you go back and read The Lord of the Rings, and you keep that in mind, the book's totally different. when you read this, and there's a moment, I don't know how many of you, if you've read The Lord of the Rings recently, it takes place very quickly. But at the end of The Lord of the Rings, after the event there's success, and Frodo has gotten rid of the ring through the grace of God and Gollum's indiscretion. Gollum takes the ring, and when Frodo and Sam leave the volcano, they stand on a rock and there's lava going everywhere. And Sam's thinking, okay, now we got to figure out how to get out of here. And Frodo says, we're not going anywhere, we're done. This is it. And Sir Martin told me that's what every English soldier who survived the war thought. They could not believe they had survived, and they felt horrible about it because their best friends were gone. They had lost everything. And for them to have survived, that wasn't the grace of God, that was chance. And it proved they were bad. They had not done their duty. So let me back up a little bit and explain this for a moment. Tolkien's lost his dad. He's lost his mom. He's raised by a great priest, Father Francis Morgan, fantastic guy, who encourages him in his scholarship. Tolkien wins a full ride to Oxford. The guy's a genius. He's one of these guys, and I do not exaggerate about this. Only other person I've read who could do this was John Paul II. It took Tolkien 6 weeks to learn a language. It took him 3 weeks to understand the structure of a language, another 3 weeks to get the essential vocabulary, and then he could go from there. I don't know if any of you knew that John Paul II did the same thing in college. He had no idea that he had a great faculty for languages. And suddenly he ended up learning something like 8 different languages in his 3 years at college. Tolkien was the same way. You introduce a language to him, he had it. In fact, the person who wrote his obituary for the London Times, and we don't know who it was, it may have been C.S. Lewis, actually, even though Lewis had died 10 years earlier. The Times may have had it already written. But regardless, whoever wrote it said, nobody of that century understood language better than Tolkien. He lived in language. And that, I think, is very important to understand for him and to get who he is. His patron saint, St. John, the Word, is then, again, giving us a tie back to Kirk. That was very important to him. And like Tolkien, Kirk and Tolkien both believed that the Word was sacred because every word is a reflection of the Word. So even if it's a written word, it's a reflection of Christ. And you can't ever manipulate words. You can't. It's like manipulating Christ. It's not the same level, but there's a continuum there, and I think that's beautiful. But so Tolkien is raised in this Catholic monastery. He's sent to a very good school. The priest can afford it. He's sent to a very good school called King Edward's in Birmingham. It's the elite, what we would call a private school there. It's called a public school, but a private school. He's sent to this, and he does extremely well. This is how he earns his way into Oxford. But while he's there, he has 3 best friends. And they call themselves the TCBS. So they are a tea company. Bavarian Society is how they put it. It's a joke. So the TCBS, but this is what's important about them. These are Tolkien's closest friends he's ever had, closer than he will have with Lewis even. These are his 3 best friends, high school all the way through college. And they decide, this is about 1910, 1911, they meet a couple of times a week, plus they're on the rugby field together. And Tolkien was actually a great athlete. We don't really remember that, but he was an excellent athlete. Small, but he was excellent, very fast. And so he would meet with these guys, and they decided, the 4 of them, right before World War I, they decided that no matter what, the 4 of them would go into professions, and he was the only Catholic, the others were Methodist. They would go into professions where they would promote the true and the beautiful in life. So they were not going to go into business, they were not going to anything but where they could write, and as they said, show the beauty of the world that had been forgotten. And if you think about the industrialization of the late 19th century and the early 20th century, and of course Tolkien's already lost his mom and his dad, it'd be pretty bleak. And yet they were just dedicated to this, that no matter what, they would live this out. They all sign up, they all volunteer. None of them are drafted. All 4 of them sign up in World War I. And at the Battle of the Somme, one of Tolkien's closest friends is killed. Another friend who writes to Tolkien to tell him that friend is killed. Tolkien writes back, before that letter reaches his friend, that friend is killed. Think about all that in Tolkien's life. He's maybe 21 at this point. He's lost his mom, his dad, the only 2 of 3 best friends he's ever had. They're gone. And this is a huge burden for him. He has the witness of his mother. How many in here have read The Lord of the Rings? Is there a dull, unpowerful woman in that book? Anywhere? Every woman you meet, everyone. Galadriel. You think about the hobbits. We only meet a couple of hobbit women. They're not always nice, but you wouldn't mess with them. You think about Éowyn, the great warrior. You never meet a weak woman, ever, in Tolkien's literature. They do not exist. They are unbelievably powerful. They're more powerful than any of the men. When Galadriel speaks and her husband tries to correct her, she shuts him down immediately. She's in charge. There's no question about this, and that is very important for Tolkien. There's no bigotry here on Tolkien. Well, if there is, it's pro-woman, right? But he is incredibly at that. And as he said later when he wrote to a friend of his, every woman he ever wrote about was a reflection of his mother and Mary, always. Every woman. There is no woman ever that he wrote about who was not half his mother and half the Virgin Mary. Right? Those were the conduits of beauty. But now think about his friends. He's lost his friends. So I'm going to read just briefly. I love this letter. It's one of the first letters we have from Tolkien, where he writes after the loss of one friend to the other friend who will die before this letter reaches him. But we have the letter. So he's writing, and only the two of them will be left. So this is dated August 12th. It's at the Psalm. August 12th. I cannot get away from the conclusion that it is wrong to confound the greatness which Rob has won, Rob's the one who died, with that which he himself always doubted we were capable of. He himself will know that I am only being perfectly sincere, and I'm no way trying to be unfaithful to my love for him, which I only realize now more and more daily that he is missing from us four. When I say that I now believe that it is the greatness which we three certainly must, and I guarantee you, nobility and holiness demands this of us, that this is now the lot of the remaining members of the TCBS, that the death of any one of its members is but a bitter winnowing of those who are not meant to be great, at least directly. God grant that I never sound arrogant about this. In fact, I now feel more humble than I have ever felt in my life. And I feel immeasurably weak and poorer than I've ever felt. When I say we are meant to do great things, I mean that we are to be instruments in God's great hands. We are meant to be movers and doers. We are meant to be achievers of great things, even though we are not the great things itself. And that will never leave Tolkien. So when I mentioned Sir Martin told me, and scolded me rightly, that I had no right to call Tolkien a poor soldier. One of the reasons I said that is because I believe Tolkien when he said he was a poor soldier. But he never once, ever talked about the war until 1968. He dies in 1973. He never brought up the war ever in his life until 1968. Even when he was with his best friends, C.S. Lewis, who had also survived, even when he was with them, they did not talk about the war. And yet Lewis said that when he reviewed The Lord of the Rings, he said anybody who went through World War I knows that's exactly what Tolkien was describing. He was describing those of us who made it and those of us who didn't through World War I. And when Tolkien was asked about that in 1968, he said, yes, that's true. When I described Frodo and Sam and Gollum crossing the Dead Marshes, I was talking about my experience in the war. It's the first time, 1968. He was born in 1892. He did not talk about that. Can you imagine what that experience must have been like? To have lived through that and to have seen your friends die, and for you to have survived and to spend the rest of your life feeling guilty that you survived? That's incredible to go through that. I mean, now we would certainly say this is post-traumatic stress syndrome. But nobody knew what that was in 1916. Nobody knew what that was in 1917. These guys sucked it up. They're English. Right? They go back to the classroom. They teach. It's not something you talk about, and yet it's always there. It has to come out in various ways. And for Tolkien, it comes out in his mythology. His mythology, which is gorgeous, is in so many ways, it's both a revelation of God's grace, it's also an act of healing for everybody who made it through that war. And so think about Frodo. There he is, the mission's accomplished, and all he wants to do is die. He's made it, and he's there, and he wants to die. Tolkien says, and for those of you who've read the book, you remember there's a moment where Frodo even claims the ring, which is a great sin. Tolkien says that wasn't a sin. Frodo was never given the grace to resist the ring. How could that be a sin? God didn't give him the grace to resist that. He made a bad choice. It's not a sin. His sin was that he wanted to die. That was his great sin. And of course, that's Tolkien talking about himself. That's the great sin. You don't get to choose that. He made it through the war because God allowed him to make it through the war. It's not his to choose, right? He did the right thing at the right moment, and he made it. His friends did the right thing at the right moment. They didn't. That's not Tolkien's fault. That's God's grace in one way or another. For any of us who've lost somebody, doesn't that change the way we think about that? I mean, how miserable are we when we lose someone in our family? And yet, when we put it in the larger perspective, that is God's grace. That's his choice. He brought that person into the world, and he can take it out. And believe me, I'm not saying this as someone who's gotten past my own demons. I understand very fully how this sounds. Tolkien did too, right? But that action, that moment, how do you deal with this? How do you live with this? So let me finish this letter. So Rob has definitely achieved greatness. He's found it, and in a way that was never small. For the greatness I mean, and I trembly hope for, will be ours as valueless, because we will see that his sacrifice was steeped in holiness, not for the cause, but because he had the courage to put himself in the way of suffering and sacrifice. He understood that, right? He understood that. His greatness, in other words, is now the most personal matter possible for us. We must always remember his death date, July 1st, as a special day, because it was that day that God reminded us that those of us who survived have a mission. Those of us who survive must now experience friendship to the nth degree. And I mean here, this is what we must do. We will create nothing new in this world, but by surviving, God has destined us to kindle old truths in a new light, and to give the world that which it has always known, but it has forgotten. Tolkien's 21. Can you imagine having that kind of wisdom? Understanding that, seeing the death of his mom, of his dad, and of his friends, and of course, after he writes this letter, it's going to be about 2 days, he's going to get news, a telegram, that this young man he just wrote to, Jeffrey, is dead. And Chris Wiseman, who's the one guy who survives, he's a great guy, he's a very good poet, but he goes off into the family business. Nothing wrong with that. Obviously, it was a great business, he did well. He went off into insurance, and he dedicated his life to that. And that meant that Tolkien was the only one left of the four who had this duty, as he thought, to write these things. So he actually, and we know this now, he actually started writing his mythology. So for those of you who've read The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien didn't start writing that until 1938. But he started his mythology, the whole mythology, the beautiful, unbelievable mythology, which is so much larger than The Lord of the Rings. He started writing it when he was in the trenches. We actually have the first scraps of language and poetry. We have the first dictionary. He wrote 2 full languages while he was in the trenches in 1916. Completely original. They're based on Finnish, but he took Finnish as a language and he looked at how they might evolve historically. He took them in different directions and he came up with 2 forms of Elvish. Now, we can make jokes about those who speak Elvish or like those who speak Klingon, right? This is as nerdy as it gets. But this is Tolkien's restless mind. And I've had the privilege of going through those dictionaries that Tolkien wrote. And I'm not surprised. I was when I first read it, but now that I know a little bit more about Tolkien, I'm not surprised what he had in those. You start reading through those dictionaries, Elvish dictionaries, as he's creating this larger mythology. He has in there words for the first person of the Blessed Trinity, words for the second person of the Blessed Trinity, words for the third person of the Blessed Trinity, called in translation the secret fire. But you remember in the book, Gandalf stands at the bridge and he faces the Balrog, which is Anglo-Saxon for demon. And he says, "You cannot pass, I'm a servant of the secret fire." Gandalf is calling the Holy Spirit down at that moment. The Lord of the Rings is the #1 best-selling novel of the 20th century. I don't know if everyone who reads it knows that it's about the Holy Spirit, but do you realize in a stealth way how many 12-year-old boys and girls have been reading a tale about Christianity that never mentions the word Christ? Tolkien's genius. He has an entire mythology rooted in Western civilization and Christian truths that kids understand and believe in and walk away from, not quite knowing why they believe this thing is real, but it's going to hit them at some point in their life. And it's not just that. If we go back to the dictionary, Elvish, there are words for crucifixion. There are words for communion. In fact, that word for communion, bread of life, is used throughout the Lord of the Rings. The Elvish make a special bread called the lembas. And if you take the lembas, even a crumb, even though your stomach is not satisfied, you can hike for a full day because you have a nourishment that's beyond the understanding of humankind. It's all right there. We meet Galadriel. She is so clearly Mary. We see Aragorn. He is fighting for his bride, Arwen, who is so clearly Mary. It is all there, and Tolkien did it in a beautiful way. For those of you, and I love C.S. Lewis, don't get me wrong, but you read Narnia, and if you miss that Aslan's Jesus, you've missed the whole story. Right? It is right there in your face. Tolkien didn't like that, and the reason is because he said God was an artist. And when Catholics produce, they produce art, not propaganda. If I had made Frodo Jesus, I would have either gotten it wrong and been blasphemous, or I would have made it so obvious that it would have lost the meaning of the story. But by putting an element of Jesus in Frodo, by making him a priest, but not a prophet, not a king, Gandalf's the prophet, Aragorn's the king, I have Jesus in there, but it's done artfully. It's not in your face. It's not smacking you, but you take the art in the way that we take creation in. We don't see Christ in every aspect of creation. He's not in the fertilizer, he's not in the soil, and yet he is. Right? God's hand is in everything we touch. And Tolkien said mythology is the same thing. In fact, what is mythology? Mythology is nothing more than history with God at some level. That's what a myth is. A myth doesn't mean a lie. We say that now in the 21st century because we perverted the word. The actual traditional meaning of mythology is a story with a supernatural element that cannot be explained by reason. I deal with professional history all the time. I just spent a whole summer reading about nothing but Andrew Jackson. Here I am a year later. I still don't totally understand Andrew Jackson. He doesn't understand me either, nor would he care to. But, I mean, think about yourselves. Are there not elements of every one of us that could never be explained by reason? We're not calculators. We're not automatons. We're not robots. We're not emotional freaks. And yet we have all of that in us in every way. And yet every human person without exception is, as John Paul II said, an unrepeatable center of freedom and dignity. And yet will never be repeated. This is what Tolkien says. In fact, as he puts it, and I love this, and I'll finish here in a moment with this, but Tolkien says, I don't like allegory. That's why I didn't like Lewis's stories. He loved Lewis, but he didn't like Lewis's stories. Aslan is too clearly Jesus. And it's not artful enough. You need to make it not propaganda, but art. But this is what Tolkien said. He said, I don't like allegory as a form in English, but I like allegory theologically. And he wrote this to W.H. Auden, who was one of his students, and they really liked each other. But he wrote to Auden when Auden said, I know you hate allegory, so what do you mean when you say Frodo reflects this, or World War I might be somehow part of this, because obviously the Lord of the Rings is greater than any of that. Frodo is greater than that. Here's what Tolkien wrote, and I don't have it quoted here, but I have it close to memorized. Not quite, but he said, I believe in one form of allegory. Every person is an allegory of Christ. Every person is clothed in a particular garment, but embodies universal truth. Now what a great way of thinking about the human person. Every person, unique. Every person made in the image of God, but God is infinite. So all of us little finite creatures will never be duplicated, but we're all clothed in a certain moment of time and space. We're all clothed. McCann's, I'm from Hutchinson. I'm born in Great Bend, born in 1967. I didn't get to choose any of that. None of that. I wasn't born in 2067. I wasn't born in 1867. I was born September 6th on the Great Bend of the Arkansas. We're the only people in the world who pronounce that river's name correctly, right? Of the Arkansas River. Right? There I was, September 6th, 1967. I didn't get to choose any of that. Not any of it. But the moment I came of reason, I've chosen every moment of my life. Sometimes badly, sometimes stupidly, sometimes reactively, sometimes pretty well. But isn't that for every one of us? Can you imagine 7 billion people in the world? We're all like that at every moment. Even people we don't like. We're all like that. Tolkien says we're allegories. Doesn't matter if you like them or not. Right? Even the orcs, Tolkien said, could be redeemed. They're creatures. Maybe they'll make good choices at some point. Right? They're all there. So I'm going to end with this. Tolkien says we're an allegory, but in his last days, and the guy never started slipping. I mean, he was actually made it all the way to September 2nd of 1973, and then he was out, but didn't suffer. He lost his wife. I mean, he suffered mentally and spiritually, but certainly he himself was in great physical condition until his death. So a little girl wrote him and asked him, Professor Tolkien, well, I've read everything you have. Right at that point, it would have been The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, no Silmarillion yet. But I've read everything, and I just want to ask you, what's the purpose of life? Tolkien laughs. He says, really? He writes her back and he says, you asked me the hardest question that's ever been asked, and you want me to answer in a letter, and you're clearly a fan. And he says, I love you, I don't know you, but you're obviously a very bright young woman, and so I'll do what I can because you've asked me. He says, but you have to know, the only great thing is that, and I quote, God included us in his design, and maybe that's enough to answer why we're here. God included us. We don't know why. We can search for that all of our lives. We just know this. In God's design, he made you and he made me. That's incredible, right? We have this moment. Maybe it's 10 days, maybe it's 75 years, maybe it's 90 years, but here we are. So let me ask this. You didn't ask me this in your letter, but I have to ask you, do you believe in a personal God? Because if you don't, I'm not sure you can actually ask what the purpose of life is. Because to whom would you even be addressing the question if you don't believe in God? But since in some odd corner of the universe, things have developed with minds that ask questions and try to answer them, you might address one of these peculiar things, even if we don't call it God. As one of them, I should venture to say, and here, of course, I'm speaking with absurd arrogance on behalf of the entire universe, I am as I am, and there's nothing you can do about it, and there's nothing I can do about it. But I know you're not happy with that answer. So let me try something else. This is what I think. There are those who believe in a personal God, a creator, but do not think the universe itself is worshipful. Though a devoted study to the universe is certainly one of the best ways of honoring the creator. And while as living creatures we are in part within and a part of this creation, our ideas of God and our ways of expressing them are largely derived from the way we contemplate the world itself. So it may be said, and this I will try to answer, what is our chief purpose in life? For any one of us, and this is what it is. Our chief purpose in life is one thing. We are to increase, according to our capacity, our knowledge of the Creator by everything he gave to us. In all of our capacities and incapacities, in all of our greatness and all of our failings, we are to understand the Creator. And once we understand at least that in our small way, we should praise him and give him thanks for making us a part of his design. And to do so, I must only repeat what I have learned in my faith. Gloria in the highest. We praise you, God. We call you holy. We worship you. We proclaim your glory. And we thank you for the greatness of your splendor. And when we're not so full of ourselves, then we can say in moments of exaltation that with all created things, we will join in the chorus. And we will ask all of creation to speak on their behalf and they on ours. And then we will do as done in Psalm 148 and as the three children do in Daniel. Praise the Lord, praise the Lord, praise the Lord. All the mountains, all the hills, all the orchards, all the forests, and all the things that creep, and all the birds on the wing. You, my little friend, this is much too long and much too short for such a vital question. Yours, Professor Tolkien. Thank you all.